work? I work all over. I don't know why or how. I just kind of end up going places. And I try to adapt to the situations that I'm in. Yes, thank you. I'm not gonna. This is like a leash. Yes. I'm free of the leash. So $500 challenge. It's how to map and model heritage structures in places that are difficult to reach, or places where you can't pull out $10 or $15 or $20,000 of imaging equipment, or where you don't have thousands of dollars to bring in wonderful professional outfits to do it for you. And this is something that's definitely been influenced by my time in India and this wonderful sort of hands-on approach that faculty have. So, a lot of times having worked in the United States and in Europe and stuff, say you want to do a environmentally responsible project, well, what do? The professors come in and they consult, and then you pay somebody to do it. In India, you roll up your sleeves, you get really dirty. Sometimes there's a guy or a geyser of sewage flying up in the air, but it gets done sooner or later. And that's really awesome because there's this very active, involved sort of process. This project actually develops out of my time in Turkish North Cyprus. And working with the city of Famagusta. So to tie in with Demetrios, this is another border and another exodus 700 years before. And incidentally, just out of pure irony, we're looking at the Syrian quarter of Famagusta, which is going to be your people like the Nestorians, the Armenians, and in this case, the Maronites. They settled in this northwest quadrant of Famagusta after the fall of Antioch. So this is the church that we're looking at in particular. If you don't know Famagusta, it's in Cyprus. It's just outside of Salamis for those who are classicists. An amazing place. If you haven't been, go to Rhodes and go to Cyprus. Salamis, right up the way. You have these sarcophagi washing out of the beach, and the breakwater is still there, and the 6th and 7th century Byzantine walls are laid down from the last big earthquake when people abandoned it. And what did they do? They moved to Arshino, which is now Famagusta. It was built up by the Byzantines, and then Richard the Lionhearted decides to grab it from Isaac Comnenus, and then he sells it to the Templars, who sell it to the Lusignan. French-Norman family, and that would be the late 12th century. Yeah. With the fall of the Outremer kingdoms, this is where the exodus begins. A lot of the Christian and Jewish populations in the Holy Land fall back to Famagusta, fall back to Cyprus, and the Lusignan kingdom is basically in this area from active from the late 12th to the early 15th century, at which point the Venetians take over, hold it for almost a century, and then the Ottomans come in. So you have this very, very rich cultural history, and it's not just the principal players. It's Syriac Christians and Jews and Muslims and Druze, and even to this day in Cyprus, there's a village. Maronite village in Turkish Cyprus. There's a holdout of Aramaic speakers in another area. There's even some Greeks that when the Turks told them to get out, they thought, nah, and they're still there. Looking at this, one of the guys I work with a lot is a guy named Michael Walsh. He's at Nanyang, and we'll talk about him in a minute and what he's done. But the Syrian quarter is particularly interesting because it was off limits to scholars for about 30 years, from 1974 with the Turkish invasion of Cyprus until 2007. And the Syrian quarter was part of a base. Military base and wasn't able to be accessed. So you have a whole host of issues and a whole history of neglect. It's not just because of the Turkish invasion. In the early 20th century, for example, this church was a stable. So anyway, after 2007, and incidentally, much like what Demetrius is kind of touching upon, you have a history of buildings being repurposed. So with this exodus, this old Latin church, this old Norman Latin church was transferred to the Maronites, who then, and it became St. Anne's. I made a new word, good. Moving along, some of the things that we deal with are, because, for example, you're looking at perhaps over a century of neglect in the modern era, more than 3 decades, there's been significant problems. There's also, for example, you can't really see this here, but there's a fresco here. There used to be a covered area above, so this was protected from the elements. It hasn't been protected from the elements for a very long time. You're losing the fresco. You have misguided or deliberately destructive changes to the buildings, plastering over frescoes, using cement. Like, oh, look, we've got a problem here. Put some cement there, watch it eat away the limestone, you can imagine. So anyway, these are some of the issues that we're looking at when we approach building like this. For example, this one, the lintel was quite heavy and large, it was eroding, and at some point somebody just filled that in with concrete. When we look at a building, we look at the issues that are addressing it. This is another one. The local stone is limestone. Cyprus is very dry except in the winter, and the runoff will have a tendency to erode a building, especially if it hasn't been maintained. A lot of times you have lead roofs and such that wear through over time, and you get this sort of degradation. My sort of work, I kind of put aside Michael Walsh. He's a professor of art history at Nanyang, a wonderful academic and much more qualified and pretty much better in every way than I am. He's a good friend, and he does this work at Nanyang where he's got quite a lot of funding. But early on, he was looking at structures and he was modeling them, and I was like, I can do better than that. And he said, okay, well, why don't you try this? And I was like, well, I want to show how you can do this very inexpensively, and you can do it in an environment like, for example, if I can take this and I can go to Old Goa and I can do something. Old Goa is, of course, the Portuguese religious center of the Portuguese overseas empire. And I'm very interested in how you can take a technology or take some experience and apply it to another culture, another place. And with the wonderful thing about working with Michael is, of course, at Nanyang, he has money coming out his ears. I didn't say that, did I? He does. But so he gets wonderful support, and he can use professional outfits, and he's a very good researcher. So, for example, while I was doing this, just on the 15th of March, Michael was doing this presentation, I believe in Padua. Yes, in Padua. This is using like orthoscans or fluoroscopy, and they're doing a VR sort of model. And this is all wonderful stuff, but it's something that I could never probably do in India. So that's kind of the problem or the challenge that I'm facing, and how to apply that. This is a little bit more about Michael. I'll skip over that. And I want to also put in this why, when, where, how background, that there's also a very important theoretical aspect of this sort of modeling and historicizing this sort of approach to a structure. What's kind of fun about this is there's all kinds of data about Cyprus, all these wonderful maps and illustrations and illuminations. For example, if you look at the third point here, in Famagusta, there is one of the bastions is called Othello's Castle. Well, and people take it as Othello's Castle. Inside of Othello's Castle, there's Leonardo's column. And people, like legitimate academics, they get a little bit sore if you, I don't think Leonardo was there. And they're like, Bellini, and you're like, Leonardo, Bellini. You know, he might have been there, he could have been there. Michelangelo was invited by, I don't know, Mehmet, to go to Constantinople. So there's this sort of very interesting idea of cultural appropriation that can often be deliberately traced back to specific events, such as the last example there, which is Venus's sarcophagus, sorry. And that's where one of the British governors, 19th century British governors, digs up this Roman sarcophagus somewhere near Paphos, plants it in the middle of Famagusta, and goes, it's Venus's sarcophagus. And then it becomes part of this local sort of narrative. So looking at buildings and looking at structures kind of puts, it's part of material culture and how meaning is created by things. And that's something that's quite fun to work with, and I'm going to show how we deal with that. Very quickly, couldn't have done this without the help of Arathi Krishna Varun Prasad and Brian Buxton, which are two students and a colleague from India and the United States. The question here is, if we look at points A and B, down at the bottom, how can students approach fields such as cultural studies, cultural history, architectural studies through building information modeling to engage in multimodal learning projects? So this is very much involved in pedagogy, and it's very much involved in the process. I cannot make a 3D model that is going to be as good as a professional outfit coming in and building it ground up using very high-tech equipment. But I can have students learn a lot more than they would ever have known otherwise by essentially, and I'll get back to this later, doing a close reading of a structure, which is very important because when you start doing the sort of drafting that we're doing, you get to know that building. So we'll look at that. The second part of that is how can projects like this be developed to enable local communities to engage in independent acts of cultural heritage preservation. And this is entirely possible. That's where the $500 challenge comes in. Incidentally, it's more like a $1,500 challenge. The idea is, it's government budgets. The idea was that you could pick up a $300 laptop and a phone and use open source software. In this case, we use Blender. But at the end of the day, I did go for an Alienware, which is kind of weird to carry around, but $620 for 16 gigs of RAM and an i7 core processor and a very nice NVIDIA graphics card, which you can actually start rendering and using your like 3D software. Whereas my Mac Air, which would put me totally out of the budget, with its 4 gigs RAM, you can't actually do anything, or you kind of sit there in timeout until you fall asleep. The other side of this is, you potentially can start making models in a very inexpensive way, and the information and ability to do it is available. The basis for comparison, we just have one slide here. This is an example of an orthoscan, very nicely done. You can see, obviously based out of medical technology, you can see the building much like an MRI. And then this is one of their VR models, and this is actually the Armenian church. Okay, gotcha. And the Armenian church is, this is basically an interactive VR model, and I'll kind of address that in the next minute when we start looking at our models, which I'll go to right now. Starting out with sketching and drafting a space, I think it's good to use hands-on approaches and actually get out there with pen and pencil. Here's the model itself. As I was saying, I used Blender here. You could have used Maya. Maya is incidentally also free for student licenses, but Blender is nice. It's primarily an animation, 3D animation software, but you can use it. You can't see really the density here, but this has a much lower, at this time we're looking at the interior layer and building up the interior layer, and I'll try to get to something more interesting there. a lot of lines, a lot of drafting lines. So this is the wire mesh model that you build first. As you can see, there's a lot of detail there, trying to do the barrel bolting, stuff like this. Later on, you put a skin on it and then you paint the surface. This was my other cheat, which is an Intuos Pro tablet. Makes life a lot easier rather than trying to trackpad a surface from photography to a model. Moving on, this is a finished project where you take the wire model, put the skin, and then start rendering a surface on it. It's literally painted on. Important point here is in terms of sort of cultural preservation, come another earthquake and the building's destroyed. This is a useful guide, but it's not an indexical model. It's an iconographic model. We put a picture up and we draft it out. So in a way, using a professional outfit to do a real architectural skin is more useful for preservation, but perhaps less useful for education. This is a workspace looking at actually creating that space. This is the very pesky bolting, which was difficult to do. And this gives you a little synopsis. So you go from wireframe, skin, and then finished product. That's a lot of hours. One of the things that is, again, really interesting is you have this history of this sort of cultural melange or cultural complexity where things are built up. And by looking, for example, at the walls or the buildings, this is the last slide, you start seeing where the Byzantine wall ends and the Venetian wall begins, where the Venetian walls were knocked down and the Ottoman walls are filled in, and you start gaining this very complex understanding of this narrative of history and narrative of building on building on building. You also start getting a feeling of what the destructive processes are, the dangers and the threats. So in a way, it's a really, sometimes very nitpicky, but also wonderfully enabling experience to start really intimately understanding a space like this. So I urge you to try it sometime. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks. So we've got just a few minutes.